For more than 2,000 years, history has sold us a very specific image of Cleopatra. A flawless queen. A woman whose beauty could stop wars. A seductress so powerful she bent Rome's greatest men to her will. Paintings, statues, poems, movies. All of them repeat the same promise. That Cleopatra didn't rule Egypt with armies or weapons. She ruled it with her face. But there's a problem with that story. Because none of the people who described Cleopatra as irresistible ever lived at the same time as her. Most accounts were written decades later. Some were written by her enemies. Others were written by men who never even saw her. And modern science is starting to ask a question that history was never comfortable asking. What if Cleopatra wasn't beautiful at all? What if the most famous face in history was a carefully constructed illusion? Even worse, what if the real danger surrounding Cleopatra had nothing to do with Rome, and everything to do with her own body? Because when researchers began peeling back the layers of myth, they didn't find romance. They found genetic warnings, medical red flags, and a royal bloodline so tightly folded in on itself that, by all biological logic, Cleopatra should never have been able to rule anything. Yet she did, which means one of two things must be true. Either Cleopatra was a once-in-a-millennium genetic miracle, or she was quietly fighting a biological nightmare while projecting the image of a living goddess to the world. And the evidence for that truth isn't written in poetry or politics. It's buried underground. For centuries, historians agreed on one uncomfortable conclusion. Cleopatra was gone forever. Her tomb, they said, had vanished beneath the chaos of history. Earthquakes shattered Alexandria. Tsunamis swallowed the coastline. Rising seas erased entire neighborhoods. Whatever monument once marked her resting place was supposedly destroyed beyond recovery. Modern Alexandria sits on top of ancient Alexandria like a locked vault. Roads, buildings, and entire districts now cover what was once the heart of Cleopatra's world. So the official story became simple. We missed our chance. Cleopatra's body was lost. Her tomb erased. The final physical evidence of her life gone for good. And for a long time, no one challenged that idea. Because searching for Cleopatra wasn't just difficult, it was embarrassing. Archaeologists didn't want to chase legends. Funding agencies didn't want to bankroll fantasies. Academia quietly moved on, until one woman refused to. Kathleen Martinez didn't arrive with celebrity backing or institutional power. She wasn't trained as a traditional archaeologist. Her background was in criminal law. And that mattered. Because instead of asking where Cleopatra should be buried, Martinez asked a different question. The kind investigators ask when something doesn't add up. If Cleopatra knew Rome was coming. If she knew humiliation awaited her. If she knew her enemies would desecrate her body. Why would she choose a tomb that anyone could find? Cleopatra wasn't naive. She wasn't impulsive. She was a strategist who outplayed Caesar and Antony on their own terms. So Martinez treated Cleopatra's disappearance like a cover-up. Not a tragedy. A calculated vanishing. While most historians searched under Alexandria, Martinez looked away from the obvious. She focused on symbolism, religion, geography, and Cleopatra's obsession with being seen not as a queen, but as a goddess. That trail led her west. Far west. To a forgotten site most experts had dismissed entirely. A crumbling temple known as Taposiris Magna. At first glance, it didn't make sense. The temple was old even by Cleopatra's time. It wasn't inside Alexandria. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't associated with royal burials. Which is exactly why Martinez believed it mattered. Cleopatra didn't want to be found. And if you don't want to be found, you don't choose the obvious place. For years, Martinez excavated with little to show. Critics mocked the effort. Funding dried up. Experts insisted she was chasing ghosts. Until the ground answered back. Deep beneath the temple floor, the team detected something unnatural. A void. When they broke through layers of limestone, they uncovered a structure that sent shockwaves through the archaeological world. A tunnel, but not a crude passageway. Not a ritual corridor. Not a drainage channel. This tunnel was massive. Over 4,300 feet long, nearly a mile. 6 feet high. Carved directly through solid bedrock. Running with impossible precision beneath the earth. Parts of it were flooded. Parts were filled with sediment. But its scale was undeniable. Engineers studying the structure struggled to explain it. Because this wasn't Roman engineering. This wasn't Egyptian improvisation. The tunnel mirrored the design of one of the greatest engineering feats of the ancient Greek world, a legendary structure considered nearly impossible to replicate, which raises a disturbing question. Why would anyone invest that level of effort? Risk collapsing unstable rock. Dig 40 feet underground. For a forgotten temple? You don't build something like this for convenience. You build it to protect something. Or someone. And when researchers examined the surrounding area, they found evidence of a sunken harbor nearby. Proof that this temple wasn't isolated at all. It was once connected to the sea. Connected to trade. Connected to power. Connected to escape. Suddenly, the tunnel looked less like an architectural curiosity and more like a deliberate route, hidden, controlled, and final. And that's when the theory turned dark. Cleopatra wasn't just planning for death. She was planning to disappear from history in a way Rome could never undo. She didn't want her body dragged through the streets. She didn't want her legacy rewritten by conquerors. She didn't want her remains used as a warning. She wanted a burial that could never be violated, a tomb that would outlive empires. And the tunnel beneath Taposiris Magna may be the first piece of that plan ever discovered. But the tunnel alone wasn't proof. The real terror waited above it. Inside the tombs, the tunnel was unsettling on its own. But what truly changed everything wasn't buried beneath the temple. It was buried beside it. As excavations expanded around Taposiris Magna, archaeologists began opening nearby tombs, standard procedure, routine work. At least, that's what they expected. What they found stopped them cold. Inside the burial chambers were mummies. Not kings, not queens, not even priests. At first glance, they looked ordinary. Time-worn wrappings, crumbling faces, bodies that had waited quietly for centuries. Then someone noticed the mouths. Where tongues should have been, there was gold. Thin sheets of gold foil, carefully shaped and placed inside the mouths of the dead. Golden tongues. This wasn't decoration. It wasn't wealth display. It was ritual. In ancient Egyptian belief, the afterlife was not automatic. The dead had to stand before Osiris, the Lord of Judgment, and speak for themselves. They had to declare their worth, defend their lives, convince the gods they deserved eternity. Speech mattered, and gold was believed to carry divine authority. A golden tongue granted the power of sacred speech, what the Egyptians called golden eloquence. But here's the part that doesn't sit right. This ritual was rare. Extremely rare. It wasn't something you gave to common nobles or wealthy citizens. It was expensive, symbolic, and deeply specific. Most Egyptians, even elites, were buried without it. So why were these mummies here? Why at this temple? Why so many? As more tombs were opened, the pattern became impossible to ignore. 16 burial chambers. Multiple bodies. Multiple golden tongues. This wasn't random. It was coordinated. And coordination means planning. The deeper researchers looked, the worse the implication became. Because these weren't priests. They weren't temple caretakers. They were courtiers, members of an inner circle. People whose entire role in life may have been tied to one person. Cleopatra. The golden tongues suggest these individuals weren't buried for themselves. They were buried for someone else. To speak for someone else. Which leads to a chilling possibility. What if these people were placed here to announce a queen's arrival in the afterlife? What if this wasn't a cemetery, but a royal reception hall? Think about what that means. This temple wasn't waiting for the dead. It was waiting for Cleopatra. And suddenly, the tunnel made sense. Cleopatra didn't want a public tomb. She didn't want monuments Rome could vandalize. She didn't want a burial that could be turned into propaganda. She wanted control, even in death. And control was something she understood better than anyone alive. By the end of her reign, Cleopatra knew exactly how Rome treated defeated rulers. She had seen it. She had lived it through her sister. Chains, parades, humiliation disguised as celebration. If Cleopatra surrendered her body to Rome, her legacy would be rewritten by her enemies. So she did what every great strategist does when cornered. She disappeared on her own terms. A hidden burial, a controlled narrative, a sacred transformation. Cleopatra didn't just want to die as a queen. She wanted to be reborn as a goddess. Specifically Isis, the mother deity, the divine ruler, the eternal feminine power that transcended kings and empires. Taposiris Magna wasn't just a random temple. It was dedicated to Osiris, Isis's divine counterpart. In Egyptian belief, Isis and Osiris ruled the afterlife together. If Cleopatra wanted to complete the transformation, not symbolically, but ritually, this was exactly where it would happen. And those golden tongues? They weren't buried there by accident. They were meant to speak her name, to announce her arrival, to confirm her divinity, which turns this discovery from archaeology into something far more unsettling. Because if Cleopatra's people were buried here waiting for her, then her body was always meant to follow. But the terror doesn't stop there. Because buried attendants weren't just symbolic. They were loyal. And loyalty like that doesn't come cheap. Cleopatra ruled through absolute control of her inner circle. Trust was rare. Betrayal was fatal. Those closest to her lived well, but they lived under constant threat. If these were her people, buried with sacred tools to serve her in death, then their placement here suggests something even darker. They knew the plan. They knew where she would be buried. And they took that knowledge to the grave. Which explains something historians have never been able to answer. Why no one ever found her. Not Roman generals. Not Egyptian priests. Not later rulers. The location may have died with the people sworn to protect it. But there's another layer to this, one historians avoided for centuries. Cleopatra didn't just fear Rome. She feared her own bloodline. Because by the time she reached the throne, she knew what her dynasty produced. Not just power, but deformity, illness, madness. And if Cleopatra suspected that her own body carried the same curse, then controlling her image, even in death, wasn't vanity. It was survival. If her remains revealed signs of genetic damage, Rome wouldn't just defeat her politically. They would erase her myth entirely. Which means the golden tongues weren't just spiritual tools. They were guardians of a lie. A final attempt to ensure Cleopatra would be remembered as divine, not damaged. But lies don't last forever. And while the tomb hasn't been opened yet, science found another way in. Not through Cleopatra, but through the sibling she eliminated. Cleopatra didn't become queen because she was loved. She became queen because she survived. The Ptolemaic court wasn't a family. It was a battlefield disguised as royalty. Power didn't pass cleanly. It was taken, defended, and paid for in blood. And Cleopatra's most dangerous enemy wasn't a Roman general or a foreign invader. It was her own sister. Arsinoe IV was young, intelligent, and politically dangerous. While Cleopatra is remembered as the strategist, Arsinoe was the wild card. Unpredictable, bold, and unafraid of confrontation. When Cleopatra was forced into exile early in her reign, Arsinoe didn't hesitate. She stepped into the power vacuum and claimed the throne. Not symbolically. Not temporarily. She ruled. And when Julius Caesar arrived in Egypt, Arsinoe didn't cower or negotiate. She raised an army. She positioned herself as the true ruler of Egypt. At one point, she even managed to trap Caesar inside the royal palace during the chaos of the Alexandrian War. That moment mattered, because it proved something that history later tried to erase. Arsinoe wasn't a weak pretender. She was competent, dangerously competent, and Rome noticed. Eventually, Cleopatra maneuvered her way back into power, aligning herself with Caesar. Arsinoe was captured and shipped to Rome, not executed, but displayed. Dragged through the streets in chains. A teenager paraded as a defeated enemy. But something unexpected happened. The Roman crowds didn't cheer. They cried. A young girl in shackles sparked sympathy. Outrage. Discomfort. That reaction saved Arsinoe's life. Instead of execution, she was exiled to the Temple of Artemis in Ephesus, one of the most sacred sanctuaries in the ancient world. Holy ground. A place no ruler dared violate. At least, not openly. For Arsinoe, exile felt like survival. She was alive. She was protected. She believed the gods had intervened. But Cleopatra hadn't forgotten. And she hadn't forgiven. Years later, Cleopatra's power was absolute. She ruled Egypt. She commanded alliances. She had Rome's attention and its fear. But Arsinoe was still breathing. And as long as she lived, Cleopatra's rule was vulnerable. Because Arsinoe wasn't just a rival. She was a symbol. A reminder that Cleopatra's power could be challenged from within her own bloodline. That couldn't be allowed. So Cleopatra did something that stunned the ancient world. She convinced Mark Antony to break sacred law. Antony sent men into the temple of Artemis. They dragged Arsinoe down the temple steps and ended her life. On holy ground. It was a political scandal. A religious violation. An act that shocked even Rome. But Cleopatra didn't hesitate. She understood something that few rulers openly admit. Mercy creates instability. and instability destroys dynasties. Orsino had to disappear, not just politically, but physically. No rival, no rallying point, no alternate claim, only one queen. And with Orsino gone, Cleopatra believed the threat was over. What she didn't realize was that this execution would echo across 2,000 years, because it gave modern science something priceless. A location. For centuries, Orsino's body was assumed lost, forgotten, erased by time like so many others, until archaeologists in the early 20th century uncovered a strange tomb in Ephesus. It wasn't ordinary. It was octagonal, a shape associated with royalty and hero cults. The tomb stood out architecturally and symbolically. It wasn't Egyptian. It wasn't Roman. It was unique. Inside, they found a skeleton. The age matched Orsino. The location matched her execution. The timeline aligned perfectly. For historians, it seemed solved. This was Orsino. And if it was Orsino, then scientists had just stumbled upon the closest genetic relative to Cleopatra ever discovered. Suddenly, the queen's biology was within reach. For decades, this skeleton shaped academic and public imagination. Reconstructed faces were made. Anthropological studies were published. Debates over Cleopatra's ancestry exploded. Entire narratives were built on these bones. But beneath the confidence was a problem no one wanted to confront. The science wasn't complete. The skeleton had been handled too many times. Contaminated. Moved. Studied using outdated methods. Early DNA tests failed. Still, scholars pressed forward because the story was too tempting to abandon. Cleopatra's sister. Cleopatra's mirror. Cleopatra's truth. Until modern technology forced a second look. And everything collapsed. Because when researchers finally located the skull, forgotten in a university archive, they didn't see a princess. They saw a question. Using high-resolution scans, scientists mapped the skull in microscopic detail. They drilled into the densest part of the bone, the biological vault that preserves genetic material long after everything else decays. And when the DNA results came back, they rewrote the story overnight. The skeleton was not female. It carried a Y chromosome. This was not Orsino. This was a boy, an adolescent between 11 and 14 years old. And the shock didn't stop there. The skull showed severe abnormalities. Asymmetry, stunted growth, deformities consistent with serious developmental disorders. This wasn't a warrior. This wasn't a political rival. This wasn't a queen's sister. This was a sick child, and his DNA didn't trace back to Egypt. It pointed toward Italy or Sardinia. Suddenly, the tomb wasn't evidence of Cleopatra's lineage. It was evidence of something far more disturbing. A child buried with royal honors, but far from home. Which raises questions no historian is comfortable answering. Who was he? Why was he buried in one of the most prestigious tombs in the region? And why did scholars spend decades mistaking him for Cleopatra's sister? The answer may be simpler and darker than anyone expected. Cleopatra's dynasty was hiding things. Children who didn't fit the image. Genetic outcomes they couldn't display. Lives erased before history could notice. And if one such secret slipped into the archaeological record by accident, how many others never did? This revelation didn't just erase Orsino from the genetic equation. It exposed a massive blind spot. For decades, scientists believed they had Cleopatra's DNA in their hands. They didn't. They had been studying the wrong body. And worse, they had been projecting modern assumptions onto ancient bones. Which means the real genetic story of Cleopatra is still missing. But the boy in the tomb left behind something just as important. A warning. Because his deformities weren't random. They were consistent with what extreme inbreeding produces. And Cleopatra's family tree wasn't just tangled. It was collapsing. Once the DNA results became undeniable, scholars were forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. For decades, the skeleton in the octagon tomb had been treated as a political key, a way to unlock Cleopatra's identity, ancestry, and appearance. But it wasn't a key. It was a warning, because the body inside that tomb didn't belong to a queen's sister. It belonged to a child whose very existence didn't make sense within the official record. An adolescent boy, somewhere between 11 and 14 years old. Young enough that his bones hadn't finished growing. Old enough that the damage was already irreversible. And the damage was severe. The skull wasn't symmetrical. One side developed differently than the other, giving the face a distorted structure that would have been obvious in life. The jaw was underdeveloped, likely affecting speech and eating. The cranial shape suggested long-term developmental stress, not a sudden injury. This wasn't an accident. It was genetic. Medical experts reviewing the scans noted markers consistent with serious inherited disorders, conditions that don't come from environment alone, but from repeated errors in DNA passed down over generations. Diseases that emerge when the same flawed genes are forced to interact again and again. In other words, the kind of disorders produced by extreme inbreeding. And that's where the terror really sets in. Because this boy wasn't buried like a reject. He was buried like royalty. The octagon tomb wasn't meant for nobodies. Its shape carried meaning. Octagonal structures in the ancient world were often reserved for heroes, semi-divine figures, or individuals meant to be remembered, not hidden. The location was prestigious. The craftsmanship intentional. The burial respectful. This wasn't a child discarded in secret. This was a child honored. Which raises a question historians still struggle to answer. Why would a sick, deformed foreign boy be given such treatment? There are only a few possibilities, and none of them are comforting. He could have been the child of a Roman noble and an Egyptian royal, a political liability, a genetic embarrassment, a living contradiction of carefully curated bloodlines. He could have been a symbolic sacrifice, someone whose death served a religious or political purpose. Or he could have been something even more dangerous, a hidden product of the same genetic practices that defined Cleopatra's dynasty. Because while this boy wasn't Egyptian by DNA, his condition mirrored what happens when power is obsessed with purity. And Cleopatra's family was obsessed. The Ptolemaic rulers believed bloodlines were sacred. They believed divinity flowed through genetics. They believed keeping power required keeping blood clean. So they married within the family. Brother to sister, uncle to niece, cousin to cousin, over and over. Each generation narrowing the genetic pool further. What modern science calls homozygosity, the repetition of identical genes, became policy. And the consequences were inevitable. Recessive traits don't stay hidden forever. Weaknesses multiply. Defects stack. The body loses its safety nets. Eventually, something breaks. In many dynasties, that breaking point came in the form of infertility, deformity, madness, or early death. In Cleopatra's dynasty, the signs were everywhere, if you knew how to read them. Ancient sources describe relatives who were obese to the point of immobility. Others with swollen necks, bulging eyes, fragile limbs, and erratic behavior. At the time, these were framed as indulgence or moral failure. Now they look like symptoms, and the boy in the tomb fits that pattern too neatly to ignore. He wasn't an anomaly. He was a preview. What makes this discovery especially disturbing is how close science came to missing the truth entirely. For decades, scholars wanted the skeleton to be Arsino. They wanted it to confirm long-held theories. They wanted it to answer modern debates about Cleopatra's race and identity. So they saw what they expected to see. A young woman, a political victim, a genetic mirror. But bones don't care about expectations. When technology finally caught up, the illusion collapsed. And with it went one of the few physical anchors scholars thought they had. Cleopatra's DNA was still out of reach. But now, something worse had replaced certainty. Doubt. Because if historians could be this wrong about one body, what else had they misunderstood? The boy's deformities weren't just physical. They told a story about survival odds. Children born with similar conditions in ancient times rarely lived long. Medical care was limited. Social tolerance was thin. Physical difference often meant social exclusion. And yet, this child survived into adolescence. That suggests protection, resources, attention. Someone cared enough to keep him alive, which implies he mattered. And if he mattered, his existence posed a problem. Because dynasties built on perfection cannot afford visible imperfection, especially not genetic imperfection, which brings the focus back to Cleopatra. Because by the time she ruled, she knew the pattern. She had watched siblings eliminated. Relatives die young. Bodies fail under the weight of repeated genetic compromise. She had seen what her bloodline produced. And she understood what Rome would do if given proof of weakness. Rome didn't just conquer lands. It destroyed legitimacy. If Cleopatra's body revealed deformity, illness, or genetic instability, Rome wouldn't just defeat her, it would humiliate her memory. So Cleopatra did what every intelligent ruler trapped by biology does. She adapted. She controlled the narrative. She hid the evidence. And that's why the boy in the tomb matters so much. He represents what happens when the curtain slips. A glimpse of the genetic cost behind divine claims. A reminder that beneath crowns and titles, these rulers were human and deeply vulnerable. His bones tell us something historians never wanted to admit. Cleopatra's dynasty wasn't just politically unstable. It was biologically unstable. And Cleopatra herself may have been living on borrowed time, which forces us to reconsider everything written about her strength, energy, and charisma. Because sometimes what looks like power is compensation. To understand what Cleopatra was up against, you have to forget everything you've been taught about royal family trees. Most families branch outward over time. Each generation introduces new blood, new traits, new genetic safeguards. Diversity protects the body. It corrects errors. It creates resilience. Cleopatra's family tree did the opposite. It didn't branch. It folded in on itself. Again, and again, and again. The Ptolemaic dynasty wasn't Egyptian by origin. They were Greek, descendants of one of Alexander the Great's generals who seized control of Egypt after his death. They ruled a land that wasn't culturally theirs, and from the beginning, they were paranoid about losing control. Their solution wasn't diplomacy. It was isolation. They adopted an ancient pharaonic custom that had already proven dangerous centuries earlier, close-kin marriage. But they didn't adopt it occasionally. They turned it into policy. Brother married sister. Uncle married niece. Cousins married cousins. These weren't exceptions. They were expectations. Marriage wasn't about love or alliances. It was about sealing power inside a genetic vault. What the Ptolemies didn't understand, or chose to ignore, was how biology responds to repetition. Modern geneticists call it pedigree collapse. It happens when ancestors begin appearing multiple times in a family tree. Instead of having 8 great-grandparents, you might only have 4. Or 2. Or fewer. The math becomes terrifying very quickly. Cleopatra's parents were almost certainly full siblings. That alone places her at an extreme genetic disadvantage. But it doesn't stop there. Her grandparents were likely uncle and niece. Her great-grandparents possibly siblings as well. When scientists model this pattern, they reach a conclusion that feels almost impossible. Cleopatra's coefficient of inbreeding may have exceeded 45%. To understand how extreme that is, you need context. The child of first cousins sits around 6%. The infamous Habsburg dynasty, whose inbreeding produced grotesque deformities and mental collapse, peaked around 25%. Cleopatra's genetic burden may have been nearly double that. From a biological standpoint, that's catastrophic. Inbreeding doesn't create monsters overnight. It creates probability. Each generation increases the chance that recessive genes, usually harmless when paired with healthy counterparts, collide with identical copies. When that happens, defects emerge. Not one, many. Bone weakness, facial deformities, metabolic disorders, immune dysfunction, neurological instability. The body loses its ability to compensate. And Cleopatra's dynasty had been rolling those genetic dice for centuries. The boy in the octagon tomb fits that pattern too cleanly to dismiss. His deformities weren't random. They were textbook outcomes of genetic collapse. And he wasn't alone. Ancient descriptions of Cleopatra's relatives read like a medical case study when viewed through a modern lens. Take her great-granduncle, Ptolemy VIII. Sources describe him as grotesquely obese, barely able to walk, carried by attendants. His limbs were weak, his movements slow, his body swollen. But it wasn't just weight. Records mention bulging eyes, a swollen neck, chronic fatigue, shortness of breath. Today, doctors recognize these as classic markers of endocrine disorders, particularly thyroid dysfunction. Which matters, because thyroid disorders don't just affect the body, they affect the mind. This is where Cleopatra's story takes a dangerous turn. Hyperthyroid conditions like Graves' disease flood the body with hormones. They create bursts of energy that feel like brilliance. They sharpen speech, increase confidence, reduce the need for sleep. But they also create volatility, risk-taking, impulsivity, mood swings, periods of intense focus followed by collapse. Sound familiar? Historians praise Cleopatra for her boundless energy, her ability to work through the night, her rapid, persuasive speech, her magnetic presence. But modern medical anthropologists are asking a quieter question. What if that wasn't charisma? What if it was chemistry? Cleopatra may have inherited the same endocrine storm that plagued her ancestors, but learned how to ride it. And that's the terrifying paradox. Biologically, Cleopatra should have been weak. Instead, she became formidable, which suggests she wasn't untouched by the genetic curse. She was managing it. In dynasties like the Habsburgs, the collapse was obvious. Faces deformed, bodies crippled, minds unstable. Cleopatra's dynasty didn't collapse that way. It adapted. Members who couldn't function were hidden, eliminated, erased from records. Children who didn't fit the divine image disappeared. The boy in the tomb may be evidence of that system in action. And Cleopatra, growing up inside this environment, would have known the stakes. She would have seen what happened to relatives whose bodies failed them. She would have understood that survival didn't just mean outmaneuvering political enemies. It meant outmaneuvering biology itself, which reframes her entire reign. Her obsession with presentation, her mastery of symbolism, her control over image and ritual. These weren't indulgences. They were defenses. Because if Cleopatra allowed the world, especially Rome, to see weakness, her rule would collapse instantly. Rome didn't tolerate flawed gods. By the time Cleopatra reached adulthood, she wasn't just navigating diplomacy and war. She was navigating inheritance, a body carrying centuries of compounded genetic risk. And unlike her ancestors, she didn't surrender to it. She studied. She experimented. She used the tools available to her, chemistry, medicine, ritual, and art, to mask symptoms and project strength, which makes her reign less of a fairy tale and more of a biological balancing act. One misstep, one visible sign, one exposed flaw, and Rome would have torn her apart. This is why Cleopatra's disappearance matters so much. Because if her remains are ever found, they won't just tell us how she died. They'll tell us how she lived, whether she escaped the curse, or simply endured it better than anyone before her. History has always struggled to explain Cleopatra's energy. She barely slept. She spoke rapidly and convincingly. She moved from crisis to crisis without slowing down. She outworked generals, diplomats, and kings. Ancient writers called it brilliance. Modern medicine might call it something else. Extreme genetic pressure doesn't always create weakness. Sometimes it creates intensity. Disorders tied to the thyroid and metabolism can flood the body with energy, sharpen speech, and erase the need for rest. At first, it looks like genius. Over time, it becomes dangerous. Cleopatra's family history is filled with the warning signs: swollen necks, bulging eyes, erratic behavior, bodies that failed early. If she inherited even part of that biological storm, then her legendary vitality wasn't effortless. It was managed. Cleopatra didn't survive by ignoring her body. She survived by controlling it. Egypt was the medical capital of the ancient world, and she had access to everything. Pain-relieving compounds to stay functional. Temple incenses to slow a racing mind. Blue lotus preparations to soften emotional extremes and create warmth during negotiations. She wasn't escaping reality. She was regulating it. Cleopatra wasn't just a queen. She was a strategist operating inside her own biology. She learned how to stabilize herself long enough to rule, long enough to negotiate, long enough to project power without letting symptoms show. And projection mattered. Because Cleopatra didn't rule as a woman alone. She ruled as a symbol. Every appearance was deliberate. Clothing, scent, posture, timing, all engineered to present her not as human, but as divine. Isis made flesh, a ruler above scrutiny. That wasn't vanity. That was protection. If Rome ever saw weakness, physical, genetic, or medical, her authority would collapse instantly. Rome didn't tolerate flawed gods, which explains her final move. Cleopatra didn't allow herself to be examined, paraded, or dissected by history. She didn't leave behind a public body. She vanished. That disappearance wasn't fear. It was control. She understood that bones tell the truth. They expose illness, stress, and genetic damage. If Rome got her remains, they wouldn't just claim victory. They would dismantle her legend piece by piece. So she denied them that power. And that's why finding her tomb now would change everything. Because what lies underground won't confirm beauty myths or Hollywood fantasies. It will reveal survival. Adaptation. A ruler balancing chemistry, image, and politics while carrying the genetic weight of a collapsing dynasty. If Cleopatra's bones show signs of strain, pain, or medical intervention, it doesn't weaken her legacy. It transforms it. She wouldn't be remembered as a flawless seductress. She would be remembered as something far more unsettling. a ruler who outplayed Rome while fighting a private war against her own body. So if the tomb is opened tomorrow and Cleopatra looks nothing like history promised, the real question isn't whether the myth was wrong. It's whether we were finally brave enough to see the truth. So if archaeologists finally break through that last wall, if Cleopatra's remains are uncovered, if science confirms she looked nothing like the legend, what happens next? Do we discard her story, or do we finally understand it? Because a ruler who survives empire, biology, and history itself isn't weakened by imperfection. She's elevated by it. Cleopatra may not have been the woman history promised, but she may have been something far more impressive. A survivor who outplayed Rome while fighting a war no one else could see. If you're fascinated by the truths hidden beneath history's greatest myths, make sure you subscribe, because the real stories are always stranger, darker, and more powerful than the legends we're handed. And now I want to know what you think. If Cleopatra wasn't beautiful, if she wasn't flawless, does that make her less legendary? Or does it make her the most formidable ruler of them all?